Okay, welcome everyone. Good morning. It's soon it will be spring if it isn't already. Welcome. We're very pleased to have Westchester DA Miriam E with us this morning, and for our brotherhood breakfast, remote breakfast. Just a few notes on programming. We have upcoming breakfast scheduled for April 24th. Rachel Hallowed will discuss politics and archaeology in Israel. And on May 8th, Dr. Daniel Polisar will discuss on the theme, "Why are Israelis the world's greatest optimists?" Should be interesting. We got these through the Jewish Speakers Bureau, thanks to Rabbi Charlie Rabinowitz for encouraging us to look in that direction. Today's event, I just want to extend thanks to our president, Michael Nathan, my Brotherhood Executive VP, Marty Kannengeiser, being instrumental in putting this together, to Laura Berger for joining us, and she will participate in the talk today. To Jane, John Lassiter, and the rest of the Temple staff for helping to organize and facilitate these events as well. And to all of you for joining us today, we really appreciate it. I'm going to give a few quick words of introduction to Laura Berger and to DA Rocah, and then they will basically carry on a conversation for a while. And as with the past events, use the chat feature to send any questions you may have, and when we get to the appropriate point in the discussion, we'll start to go through the questions. And I hope everyone has an enjoyable time this morning. So Laura Berger has been a longtime member of Temple with her husband John and their sons. She served as chief of the criminal division in the Southern District of New York, the U.S. Attorney's Office. Was responsible for all of investigations and prosecutions spanning many subject matters: terrorism, national security, corruption, security and financial fraud, cybercrime, violent crime, money laundering, child exploitation, sex trafficking. She had served as an assistant U.S. attorney for 10 years. And also in several leadership positions, Deputy Chief of Appeals and Chief of General Crimes. She's been a partner at Cooley LLP as well. DA Rocah was elected to this position in November of 2020, following a substantive career as Assistant U.S. Attorney from 2001 to 2017 in the Southern District of New York, overseeing prosecution of organized crime, gun traffickers, corrupt officials, narcotics dealers, sex traffickers, and child predators. Received numerous United States Department of Justice recognitions, awards, including the 2016 Women in Federal Law Enforcement Leadership Award. She was promoted in 2012 by U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara to Chief of the Westchester Division for the Department of Justice, and served as primary liaison with law enforcement agencies and other prosecutors' offices, including the Westchester DA's offices. Prior to the career at Southern District, she clerked for Judge John Gleason of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of New York, and Chester Straub for the U.S. Court of Appeals of Second Circuit. She's most recently Pace University School of Law's Distinguished Fellow in Criminal Justice and a legal analyst for MSNBC and NBC News. With that, have no further ado, and I'll turn it over to Laura and DA Rocah. Thank you.
So I can start. We didn't actually talk about who was going to start first. Just thank you so much, Larry, for having me and for letting me participate in what should be a really good conversation with the district attorney, who I'm very excited to hear what she has to say and what she has in store for Westchester County. Mimi, I don't know if you want to say a quick hello.
Sure, yes. This is the one part we didn't go over, Laura. It's great to be here with all of you. Laura is a former colleague and friend, so when she asks, I come. You know, on a personal level, I really enjoy talking to groups, particularly at synagogues. You know, I get to talk about my heritage and my background a bit more and how it impacts my work, which is very meaningful. So thanks for having me, and I'm really looking forward to it. And you know, I know we'll talk a lot about me, but you know, I really hope you all do understand what a superstar Laura is and was at the Southern District, and how much so many of the women in particular look up to her. So.
Well, thank you. But this is about the district attorney, and right back at her. Mimi has had a storied career in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and now in Westchester County. It's she's an icon for law enforcement and for justice, and we're lucky. I'm privileged to participate in this, and we're lucky to be able to have what I hope will be a fairly informal conversation today. So I guess with that, let's just jump in. You've been in office for more than a year now. You took office. I had a lot of hope, and I was dying to see what you were going to do with the Westchester DA's office. What were your priorities, and how's it been going?
So it's been kind of a whirlwind. You know, I definitely take the approach of I never want to feel like I promised something or you know, aimed to do something that I then just let go. So I either want to do it and succeed and fulfill that promise, or I want to, you know, go down trying, so to speak. And of course, when you come in and take over any institution, you know, you also need to adjust and see the culture and the sort of traditions and ways that place has been operating. So you have to do a little bit of both. So some of the things, though, that we were able to do kind of right off the bat and in the first year, and there are a lot, I won't go through the whole laundry list, but I'll tell you a few of them to kind of tee it up, you know, if we want to talk about any of them more in depth. One of my biggest priorities was putting in place a conviction integrity unit. We actually call it a conviction review unit. And I think this is where a little bit of my heritage does come into play. You know, as a lawyer, as a prosecutor, but also as a Jewish person, you know, there is nothing more important than ensuring that innocent people are not wrongly convicted and imprisoned. That is just a betrayal of everything that I stand for and have been taught to prioritize. So both in my personal life, my religious life, and as a prosecutor, I mean, that was something we were taught in the Southern District of New York. The minute anything had even a whiff of something's not right here, alarm bells should go off, and they did. And so that institutionalizing that into a bureau, into a unit that has guardrails and independence from the office to actually make objective determinations is really feels like a success to me to have been able to institute that, because we didn't have one here in Westchester, such a bureau, such a unit. And we hired 3 amazing women, all former defense attorneys with work exoneration experience, who are simply amazing and are already at work. So that was probably been one of the first, and you know, if I do nothing else, I feel that was a huge accomplishment for our county and our people. Some of the other things that we were able to do right off the bat, you know, I put a real priority also on serving victims and making sure that victims of crimes, especially violent crimes, especially women in domestic violence and sexual abuse, families of homicide victims. And so while that is obviously something that the office already was doing, there's always room for improvement. And so I put in place, for example, a rule that within 48 hours of any homicide, our office would reach out to the families of homicide victims. That sounds like something I think you would say, well, of course, that, you know, was that not happening? And the truth is, it was happening by the police departments. because they are usually the ones sort of involved in the initial stages. And our office wasn't reaching out until we actually had charges pending. But I thought that given the victim services that we have available in our office, we should reach out sooner. So that's one example of some of the things we've been doing in terms of victim services. A couple of other priorities, obviously we're always fighting violent crime, gang violence, gun violence, and we have all sorts of programs that I know we'll have a chance to talk more about that we've put into place over the past year, largely consisting of partnerships with other people in other law enforcement partners, because that's such an important part of fighting and preventing and responding to violent crime, which fortunately in Westchester, we have not seen the same spike of that we have seen in other parts of the state, in the city and to the north of us. But Westchester, I'm not saying there hasn't been any increase, but it has not been the same kind of spike that we've seen elsewhere. And the last area I'll mention overall that we've done a lot of work on is diversion, because while I strongly believe in taking an aggressive approach to violent crime, I do also think that we need to do more in the criminal justice system before it gets to the point of people, actors being violent. And so much, anyone that you ask who's been in the criminal justice field for a long time knows that so much of the violent crime we see is largely due to untreated mental health and or substance abuse problems. And so how do we prevent the violent crime of 5 years from now? We start treating the person that gets picked up, arrested, stopped for a much lower level non-violent crime. And we start trying to get them into social services and get them help and not into the criminal justice cycle and system. So that's something I really believe in, this diversion approach, if you will, in terms of offering diversion and treatment and services to people who have not committed violent crimes, who are first or second time offenders, who we put through a certain screening process, and then taking a much more aggressive approach when it comes to violent crime.
That's great. And I think we should touch on a number of those things because you just said a lot. And at the very end there, I was going to ask you to stop and explain what diversion was, because it's not obvious, but I think you got to it at the end. Sure. So what kind of challenges have you encountered? I mean, you mentioned obviously you took over an institution that had its own traditions that was already operating. And I know from experience, you can't steer a ship really quickly and just sort of shift on a dime. It just doesn't work that way. But other than that kind of institutional, difficulty, has there been anything you found particularly hard to overcome, either expected or unexpected?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, there's a lot that's hard to overcome. And we've used every metaphor, the one you just said, turning a ship and climbing up a mountain and, all of those metaphors that are true when it comes to coming in to an institution that has been in existence for a long time and that has people who have been there for a long time who are, wonderful. I mean, I have gotten to work a little bit with some of the prosecutors there, the leadership in particular, when I was still a federal prosecutor and I was in charge of the White Plains division for SDNY, I got to work a lot with the Westchester DA's office. But it isn't really until you're there and you're meeting with people on a daily basis, as you know, Laura, and hearing about their cases and, in detail and seeing what they do on a day-to-day basis of, running to the scene of a homicide, spending all weekend talking to a victim of domestic violence, and trying to get her services so she can get out of the home, doing an interview of a child who we think may have been sexually abused, and you have to do an interview in a very certain way in a very controlled environment. And, those can happen often in the middle of the night. So there's just so much that goes into the job. And so I think one of the hurdles, quite honestly, is I didn't grow up in that office. I think that, there's a little bit of, I need to make sure that people there trust me, because I am trying to make some changes. There's no question. And they know that. And so you have to try and earn the trust of the people in the office so they don't just feel that changes are being hoisted upon them, imposed upon them, but that not everyone, and maybe not every time, but that they understand what the goals are. And, I think that I kind of learned that a little bit over time, and I've gotten better at communicating that within my office as opposed to just without the, outside of the office. I definitely have been a prosecutor in some form essentially for, I don't know, 20 years almost, but never in this office, in this iteration. And I, need to, I like bringing a new, fresh perspective to things, but I also have to remember that, it's got to be, it can't be imposed. It has to be explained. And I've been trying to do that. We did eliminate the term, this is the way we've always done it. We said on the first day that I don't want to hear that anymore, because that's not a good reason to keep doing something. It may be that you have always done it that way for a good reason, but let's get to what that good reason is. And the last thing that I would say in terms of challenges is, look, working with the police departments across this county. I've worked with law enforcement partners, whether they be federal, FBI, ATF, DEA, or local police departments my whole career. It's different in this role. And there's a definite push-pull. One of the things that I have prided myself on is being able to bring people together who have different views, who think differently about things, and find areas of compromise. It's hard to do in this job, but I'm still very much trying to do it. That's the approach I take. And I think it's been successful, not every time and everywhere. We have 42 police departments, plus all the federal agencies in Westchester. So this is a very unique environment to work with law enforcement. But I am working on trying to bring us together to areas where we can work more collaboratively, because I really believe that's the key to public safety.
Yeah, and I know I saw that personally, that over the last year that you have been really trying to bring together all of those constituencies. And the DA is not engaging in hyperbole when she talks about how complicated it is. Westchester has so many different municipalities and so many different separate police officers. Plus there is this overlay, as she said, of federal law enforcement and federal task forces that work with the local police departments that make it very complicated. And anyone who knows anything about institutional politics knows each institution has its own issues and agenda sometimes. And so bringing everyone together in aid of law enforcement is tricky. And I've seen it. You have been really trying. And I think particularly in the area of violence and guns, you've been making some real progress, which we'll talk about. So let me ask you this, because this was something that was bouncing around over the last couple of years in the public discord, and it came up a couple of times recently at the Southern District of New York. People would ask me, people talk about progressive prosecutors these days, and you keep hearing that term. And I don't know exactly what the definition of a progressive prosecutor is. I've never heard the same definition twice. So I'm sort of curious, jumping from that, whether you have a particular philosophy about how to prosecute, like what the goal should be, and how what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, I touched on it a little bit, and so I do try to stay away from labels altogether, and I wouldn't necessarily have said that before this job, but in this job I find, and just more recently, I mean, I think we see it, I find that the labels are so detrimental, because people put you in a certain bucket and say, oh, you're a reform prosecutor, so you don't believe in putting people, that people should go to prison. That's not true for me. Or people say, oh, you are not a reform prosecutor. You have relationships with police chiefs, so you must be too cozy with the police. Not true. I have professional working relationships with police, as I must and as I want to. Of course, that's part of my job, but I am not. It's not about a friendship. It's about a professional relationship. So there's all these sort of, I think, somewhat dangerous buckets we get put in with labels. So I really try to stay away from those. I also try to stay away from the big public pronouncements of, you know, we are not prosecuting X kind of crime, or we will always seek the highest sentence on X. Now, I've modified that a little bit. For example, you know, bail reform is a very controversial topic in New York right now. I recently did have to sort of put out what I considered a little bit more of clear guidance to my office, that in all homicide cases, we will seek detention unless there is some mitigating reason not to.
Can I stop you there? When you say
Yeah.
seek detention, what does that mean in case there's anyone?
Sure. Meaning we're not going to ask for a bail package for them to be let out with a bail package pre-trial. In homicide cases where someone has been killed, as a presumption, we will, what I instructed them is you should seek that they have pre-trial remand when someone has been charged with a homicide. But I always say, if there are mitigating reasons not to, we should discuss it, and we do. And because we're a moderate size office and not a huge office, and we are not fortunately dealing with, you know, massive numbers of homicides on a weekly basis, I personally and my team can be involved in talking about those things if people come to us in a really detailed way. And that's something I very much want to do. I'm very in the weeds on cases when they are brought to my attention. And, you know, I don't know that DAs in bigger offices have that luxury of sort of being briefed on, you know, cases as frequently as I am. It probably drives the prosecutors in the office a little crazy, but it is something that I enjoy, and is something that I really consider part of my job, because that's how we set policy. I can't do that if I don't know what's going on individually in the cases and give our points of view. So I try to stay away, though, from these sort of rigid rules. Again, that is something I learned from the Southern District. We had presumptions, but everything was on a case-by-case basis, because we are talking about human beings on all sides, right? We're talking about human beings who are charged with crimes. We're talking about human beings who are victims. And so it's hard, I think, to make rigid rules. And I don't like being put in sort of one, you know, stereotyped into a particular bucket or another, and which then causes people to make assumptions about you. So I do try to stay away from labels, and I try to explain my general approach, which I mentioned to you all, which is, you know, this sort of violent crime, aggressive approach, aggressive investigations, aggressive on sentencing, of course, looking still at the person and the mitigating factors, but, you know, once something has reached that level, but also trying to get at the root causes of all of this and preventing them down the road by working more on programs that offer alternatives before people become violent, and to at least supporting and working with our community partners and other government partners in terms of offering support to young people who might otherwise end up in gangs, for example.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I appreciate, it's more important to understand the substance of what your approach is than it is to put a label on it. And the labels, like I said, I never quite know what those labels mean, because people have different interpretations of them. On a little bit of an off topic, you mentioned it's a moderate size office and you're able to get in the weeds on things. Can you give us a sense just of how many prosecutors and staff you have in the office? I don't know that everybody knows.
Sure. Not enough. I will say that. Probably everyone will say that, but I will definitely say that right now. We have about 130 ADAs. I'm going to give like a give or take number, and we have several vacant spots right now, which I can explain a little bit if you want to get that in the weeds. And we have about 35 criminal investigators. So those are, you know, former police officers, federal agents. Now I've brought several with me who work as investigators to support the work of the office and work collaboratively with other law enforcement agencies. And then we have a large number of support staff, so non-legal staff including, victim support people, and again, not enough. And to get all together, it's about 240 people. So it is definitely, in the world of prosecutors' offices, mid-size. I mean, there's some very small ones to the north of us, that are anywhere from, 10 people to, 40. And then in the city, you have, 5, 6, maybe even 800 in Brooklyn, I want to say. So they're large offices.
You mentioned victim services a number of times, including having people, but not enough in victim services. What kind of services are available to victims?
So we have domestic violence aides, several of them, and they really are the heart and soul of much of the domestic violence work that we do, which is quite extensive. We have a division called the Special Prosecutions Division, which oversees domestic violence cases, well, intimate partner violence. So, the term domestic violence is a little bit outdated. So it can be a parent-child, it can be a couple that is residing together, it can be someone who is married, every sort of iteration of that you can think of. And child abuse and adult sex crimes. That was actually one of the changes I made in the beginning. Our adult sex crimes unit had been moved years ago, I don't even know when, but moved out of special prosecutions into our regular trial division. And I thought that it should come back to special prosecutions because, again, these are cases that deal with victims who experience a particular kind of trauma on top of the trauma that comes with any violence. And so these prosecutors in special prosecution are more trained in a victim centered, trauma-informed approach. And so I wanted our sex crimes unit to be brought back to that home. And we did that, and that was good, although, it did increase the workload of that division. So now I need more prosecutors for that division. So the victim services, though, are really focused on both helping when it comes to domestic violence, helping people get out of situations and coordinating with the nonprofit type of organizations like My Sister's Place, Pace Women's Justice Center, trying to get people, alternative shelter, to leave situations if necessary, and trying to just support them through therapy and other kinds of services to keep them engaged in the case. I mean, part of the problem in the dynamic of intimate partner cases is charges get filed and then, and I'm not saying this in a blaming way, but victims often don't pursue the case because it goes back to this dynamic where they're making, excuses basically, or buying the excuses of the perpetrator. So we have, we're trying to get a trauma therapist, a Spanish-speaking trauma therapist. We have one trauma therapist, but we need more, and we need Spanish-speaking ones in particular, for, again, for domestic violence, sex crimes, child abuse. I mean, there's just so many services to provide and not enough people to do them.
Yeah, thanks. So going back to violent crimes, which you've talked about several times, you mentioned that violence has not been spiking in Westchester the way it has in so many other parts of the state, which is obviously terrific. But candidly, I was pretty surprised as a federal prosecutor by how much violent activity there is and how much gang activity there is in Westchester County, particularly in certain pockets of the county. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that and what's driving that and what efforts you're making to address it.
Sure. So we're doing a lot. I would say, kind of the first and most kind of basic approach, as I mentioned, is coordinating even more with our law enforcement partners across the county. So to kind of, I mean, that was happening already, but it, again, always room for improvement. And so when we started seeing this spike in other areas of the state, we formed a gun and gang task force with the areas where this kind of gun violence that we're talking about, gang violence, is most prevalent. And that is Mount Vernon, Yonkers, the county police who oversee everything, and New Rochelle. I knew I was forgetting one. So those are the three cities, you know, to generalize a little bit, but where we see the most kind of gang activity. And some of it is, you know, gang crossover from other parts, you know, from the Bronx, from the city. So we formed this task force, and what that means is that in addition to the normal kind of collaboration that goes on, there's a point person in each one of those departments. And the FBI is also part of that, as is the Southern District of New York. And so everyone knows sort of who to call when there is some kind of gang activity, because, you know, if you have a gang shooting in New Rochelle, it is extremely likely, possible, if not likely, that the person who committed that act is not from New Rochelle. They may be from Yonkers, they may be from Mount Vernon, they may be from the Bronx. So you need all those partners to come together to pull everything they have to make sure that, you know, we're sort of looking through a wide enough lens to solve that crime. So that's sort of on the law enforcement reactive side. On the preventative side, and it's been very successful. We announced that last summer, and there's been a lot of collaboration that's happening. And also one thing, Laura will appreciate this, I very much have said no turf battles. So, you know, there is a history of turf battles in law enforcement, you know, people, mostly because everyone, you know, wants to do the cases. I mean, we're all prosecutors and law enforcement for a reason. We like doing cases when they happen. But what I have said, and I think we have really started to practice, is we will go where the case makes the most sense. And so we have a really good dialogue with our federal partners to figure out if that means, sometimes it means going state and sometimes it means going federal. And we're doing that both in the gun and gang area and in the human trafficking, sex trafficking area. That comes up quite a bit because these are cases that don't stay sort of neatly in one geographic border. The other thing that we're doing preventatively is we joined, there's a group called HIDA. Doesn't matter what it stands for because it's not a good description, but it's a law enforcement group in the city that has been in existence for a long time. And it brings together, again, people from a big geographic region, law enforcement, and really focuses on gun violence. And we joined that group. They meet every day, every morning of the week in the HIDA headquarters in the city. It's the New York City Police Department, it's all the DA's offices from the city, and now we join that as well. The Yonkers Police is part of it. Not all of the departments up here are, but that was very important for me to have a presence with that task force because, again, you know, the more information that we get from our city law enforcement partners, the better it is for us because there's more overlap than one would think. And it's helping us to develop relationships better with ATF so that we can do more gun tracing, figure out where the guns that are used here are coming from. You know, are they coming from Georgia or are they coming from South Carolina? You know, can we pinpoint, you know, certain areas? We know they come from outside of New York. That's you know, that has always been true. They're not manufactured here in New York for the most part. So, but where are they coming from? And then can we do target enforcement with our federal partners in those areas? And the last area that I would mention in terms of prevention, which is a little bit different because it's not gang violence per se, but it is gun violence. I believe on here somewhere is Barrett Berger, who works on my team, also a former federal prosecutor, but spent more time in the Eastern District than the Southern District. So, you know, she brings that diversity. She's not just a Southern District federal prosecutor. And she's working on gun violence prevention initiatives for my team. And we have been very involved in what's called Safe Storage Initiative, which may sound a little bit quaint almost, but it's actually really important. And what it is that in New York State, we have a law about guns needing to be safely locked and separated from ammunition when they are kept in a home. But how many times that actually happens is probably not much. And most young people who die either by suicide or use a gun in a crime or in a school shooting, the majority of them get the gun from their own home or a home of a relative or friend. So having guns safely stored literally can save lives, particularly when it comes to the risk of suicide, which is really at a crisis proportion when it comes to young people all over the country and even here in New York. So that's something that Barrett has been very involved working with the schools across our county to get the word out about safe storage and really promote it along with Moms Demand Action, which is a non-political grassroots organization dedicated to stopping gun violence. And we also have what's called a red flag law here in New York, which is unique, which allows guns to be taken away from individuals who are showing signs that they might be a danger to themselves or to others before that actually happens. And law enforcement, schools, prosecutors, and family members can petition to have the gun taken away on a temporary basis by a judge with an order. And then there's a more full process and hearing where it can become permanent. So that has been in existence for a while, that law, but very rarely used. We've been doing a lot of outreach and training, again, to schools, to our law enforcement partners, to our own office, to get the word out and teach the process of using what's called ERPO, or Red Emergency Risk Protection Order, or red flag law, to make sure that we're using that tool as much as possible. And we've seen a great increase in the past year since we started doing that. We went from having like 2 ERPOs in the whole county to having, I think, 20 or so. So we're well on our way.
And how does the safe storage program work? Is it just educating people and doing outreach? Do you have any sense as to whether you're increasing awareness of it and basically making us safer?
Yeah, I mean, it is really about increasing awareness. And again, we've been doing that together with Moms Demand Action. We've done flyers that we've asked all the schools to put in the backpacks of every kid in every school. We did it, I believe, on the day of the anniversary of the Sandy Hook shootings. And we got a good response from the schools on that day. But it is important to send that message in conjunction with, that is where guns used in school shootings largely come from. And we do trainings with Moms Demand Action. I know Barrett has done several of them to different groups, and getting the word out to parents. It's not about don't have a gun, a legal gun. It's about safely store it.
Changing topics a little bit, hate crimes. This is an area where the turf battles tend to go in the other direction. At least my experience is that the state tools for hate crimes are probably better than the federal tools often in many circumstances. Hate crimes, there's been a lot of talk about it nationally. Certainly in New York, we hear that hate crimes are on the rise, particularly against certain groups. What are you seeing in Westchester? And what are there particular types of things in particular that you're seeing and that you're trying to address?
So yes, we have seen a rise in hate crimes overall in the county. Or I would say in bias incidents and hate crimes. But again, not to the degree we've seen in other areas of the state. And the reason I said bias incidents is I think when we hear hate crimes, we understandably think of the really violent ones that we've heard about in the news, targeting whether it be, Asian groups, Asian American people, Jewish American people, You know, but there are a lot of what I call incidents, bias incidents that aren't necessarily physically harmful to individuals, but are crimes, you know, on property, a swastika being painted on a playground or a building somewhere, or a Black Lives Matter sign being taken down, ripped down, or painted over, things like that, that I think historically have not been treated as law enforcement type issues because there isn't a harm to an individual. But I've really tried to change that perspective from day one, because I think that the harm to the community can often be just as, not just as great, but also great. Having that happen in your community can actually impact, you know, a whole lot of people to feel traumatized, to feel nervous, scared in their own community. And so we have to make sure that there's a law enforcement as well as other kinds of responses, so that people feel protected, because that's what hate crimes, much like terrorism, you know, do. They erode this feeling of security often. And so we really have worked with our departments across the county to make sure that no matter how small or big the incident might be, we do give a response to it. And, you know, we take that into account, that philosophy, when deciding how to resolve cases, whether, you know, to give them certain kinds of plea dispositions. So a property type crime that is a hate or bias crime, I would treat differently than other nonviolent crimes when deciding whether or not to give a certain kind of plea offer, because to me, the impact on the community, even though it's a nonviolent crime, is so great. We have had some really, we have had a couple, not a lot, but a few absolutely horrific violent hate crimes in the county. The one, two in particular that come to mind, one against a young Black woman in the Ossining area, and one just recently against an Asian elderly woman in Yonkers. And, you know, when we can charge them as hate crimes, we do, we will, we are. It's not always easy to do that, because you have to prove a certain level of intent, as you know, Laura, above and beyond regular criminal intent. But if we can, we do. And I think it's important to do that when we can.
Yeah, and just for people who don't know, the intent would be, you have to show that that's actually why the crime was committed, right? I mean, that they're doing it, they're motivated by a bias against a particular group or individual, which would be hard.
And one thing I forgot to mention that we did very early on is we established a hotline for hate crimes. We have in general, we established a tip line, 914-995-TIPS. And it has different options when people call, and, you know, you press 1 for hate crimes, 2 for public corruption, 3 for, you know, internet fraud. People leave a message, and then those messages get directed to people in my office who are coordinators in those particular areas. So I have a fantastic hate and bias crime coordinator who I appointed early on, who's just incredible. I can't say enough good things about her, Catalina Blancos Butagos, and she is just incredibly proactive and wonderful. And so she, and we now have a dedicated analyst, criminal analyst, kind of like an investigator slash, you know, analysis person to work with Catalina. And so they would listen to any calls that came into the hate crimes part of the hotline. And we make sure that every call gets responded to. That was very important to me. I hate when, you know, people call a government office and they leave a message and it never goes anywhere. So that's, you know, every now and then one slips through the cracks, but people know I get very upset about that. So that's been successful. I mean, we wanted to have a place. There's also the Human Rights Commission in Westchester also has a hotline that I think is well utilized. And of course, we always tell people if there's an emergency situation, they should always call 911. This is more kind of, I saw someone, something that's an investigative lead, or I'm concerned about something that's happening to me. So we do get leads as well from that hotline.
You mentioned internet fraud in your list of things that people could select when they call the menu on the tip line. And I think we all know, I certainly know from the federal perspective, that internet fraud is just rampant. And it's particularly targeted between internet fraud and telemarketing schemes. It's targeted and has a particularly pernicious effect on older people who, for whatever reason, are more vulnerable to this sort of scam. So what are you seeing, and what are the tools you have to try to fight this? I know this falls in the area of nonviolent crime, but it can be very, very, very disruptive to people who are victims of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've seen this both on the federal side and the state side. I've seen it in my personal life with my own elderly mother. And frankly, though, I mean, I know lots of young people who click on the message that seems to come from a friend over Facebook Messenger, which is often a culprit. I almost never open a Facebook Messenger. I've learned that recently. They're almost always some kind of hack. So find another way to communicate with friends other than Facebook Messenger if you can, is one little off the record advice. But we have a identity theft. We have two internet safety type coordinators in our office. One is focused on the identity theft piece that we're talking about, and one is focused on the other kind of internet safety that I worry a lot about with children, in particular young people, and sexual exploitation that often happens over the internet. So those are sort of, I'll just mention that one. I know that's not what we're talking about here, but that is something that we work on as well. In terms of identity theft, we do a lot of outreach, speaking, having my coordinator come and speak to different groups. We have an elder fraud type sort of task force within the office. It's a combination of our prosecutors who work in the Special Prosecutions Division and do elder abuse where elderly people are victims. And then we also have people in our Economic Crimes Bureau. So they work together and our investigators work with them. And, we really try to, those would be cases, look, particularly where older people are targeted, even though they're nonviolent, if we can prove that kind of manipulation and intent, I would seek some kind of enhanced sentence on something like that. And, make that be known as a deterrent. But the truth is, look, we're never going to end that. I mean, there will always be people out there trying to manipulate over credit card fraud, identity theft, and things like that. And so the best things we can do are try to encourage people to protect themselves, very basic things like no one's going to call, anyone who calls you and asks for identifying information and your mother's maiden name is probably not real, and you should hang up and call again. And, I don't mean to sound it, we all know it, but it can happen in an instant of, oh, what did I just do? Knowing, going, instead of clicking on links that are sent to you, going to the official site for something and going through customer service that way. So, they're kind of that, again, none of these are foolproof, but they are at least sort of some of the more basic things that we can do to, on its face, prevent some of the more targeted crimes.
Yeah, it's hard. And we've all seen, and the scammers are getting better and better, and the emails can be more and more persuasive. Talk a little bit, if you will, about police misconduct. And you talked about having a professional relationship with the police departments, which you absolutely have to have. But every so often, there are instances of police misconduct, and that also falls to you. So it's a tricky balance, I would assume.
It is, it definitely is. So, one of the other things I did when I started was I enhanced our public integrity bureaus. So we had, I think when I came in, there were 2 prosecutors doing all the public integrity, meaning law enforcement, elected officials, anyone who held any kind of public office, lawyers, so, broadly defined. So what I did is I hired additional people, doubled it to 4, which doesn't sound like a lot, but for our office, it's the most we've ever had. I split it up so that we have sort of a public integrity focused prosecutors and investigators who do all the non-law enforcement work, and then 2 prosecutors who do the law enforcement focus. And that means police departments, corrections officers, law enforcement can be a little more broadly defined than we think of. And they do both the they receive both the use of force complaints and also other kinds of fraud and corruption allegations that might come up. And some of these come in from the public complaints, and those obviously have to be extremely, vetted and investigated. Just because a complaint comes in doesn't, it's a starting point, and that's it. And sometimes there are referrals from police departments who have had things happen that they know should be referred to the DA's office. And some departments are great about referring those to us, and others are, not as consistent, but overall, I would say it's pretty good. So I personally, me and my executive team review with our law enforcement integrity prosecutors, every use of really every case that comes to that will be reviewed in depth by us. If it's a use of force case, we'll review the body cam video, the surveillance video. We'll really get in the weeds looking at the evidence with them, because these are huge. I mean, every decision we make in this office is hugely consequential and important. But these, I guess if I were going to have to rank them, I would put this near the top for obvious reasons. We have actually only charged 1 police officer since I've been in office with a crime. And I have reviewed, I don't have the total, but dozens and dozens and dozens of them in my time. So, that should tell you something in and of itself, both how importantly and seriously we take this, and also I think something good about the state of law enforcement in Westchester. Now, whether something can be charged as a crime or not is a very high burden, as it should be, right? I mean, somebody can do something that we might sit here and say, well, that's not good, but that doesn't make it a crime that can be charged. So it's a very high threshold, again, as it should be for any crime. But for me, the sort of difficult areas where we can't charge it as a crime, but it is not something as a professional in law enforcement or a citizen of this county that I, want to see perpetuated. And so that's been an area that's probably the most tricky to navigate. I mean, the charging a crime, look, when we charged a particular police officer, yes, I got lambasted by the PBA for doing that. I say the PBA, not police commissioners, and that's going to happen. That will happen, I believe, anytime a police officer is charged with a crime, whether it's the right decision or not, I will get blasted by the PBA, and that is something I expect and understand. But, this sort of area of it's not a crime that we can charge, but we got to do something about this has been the trickiest, because we don't have a civilian complaint review board here in Westchester. Depending on the department, they have different levels of internal review and investigations. So I would say, honestly, that's the area I'm trying to sort of navigate the most. Sometimes it means turning to federal partners. I think it's been reported pretty widely in the press that I referred some allegations about the Mount Vernon Police Department and their strip search policies and other policies to the Department of Justice, who, after their own very independent determination, decided that they would do a civil rights pattern and practice review of the Mount Vernon Police Department practices. And, you know, that was great to see, because that is clearly not something that we have the jurisdiction to do or the resources to do. So to see the federal government step in that role was appropriate and welcomed.
Couple more things that I wanted to make sure we talked about that you haven't talked about yet. I know from public reports that one of the things you did that was new was establishing a cold case bureau. And I was wondering if you could talk about why you thought that was an important thing to do in the beginning of your term and how that's going.
Yeah, so it's a really simple concept that, you know, we don't forget about the victims' families. And there are cases that are harder to solve than others. And sometimes after a while, you know, unintentionally might get pushed to the back burner because new cases happen and, you know, limited resources and prosecutors' offices and police departments turn to, okay, we've got a new murder homicide to solve. So we formed this cold case bureau where there are people who aren't doing the, okay, reactive work, you know, homicide happened today, what are we going to do, but are focused on looking back. Now, it isn't just any old unsolved homicide. There are certain criteria for how long it's been, over 5 years, whether there is new evidence or leads that would cause us to think that it might actually be some hope of solving it now. The police departments have really, really welcomed this. You know, there are in almost every department, there's some detective who, you know, has had that case sitting on his shelf that he or she wanted to solve and needed, you know, the time and the resources and the prosecutors to focus on it. And so we've already had, and the families, victims, the victims' families have really been asking for it, and have, you know, I think it means a lot to them to know that people aren't giving up on cases. So we've already charged at least 3, I think, that were previously unsolved homicides. The highest profile one was Robert Durst, but there have been ones that are not, you know, as much in the media, but certainly as important. And we have many, many more that are being investigated. And I definitely picked the right person to make, you know, the sort of chief of this inaugural bureau, Laura Murphy. She's a longtime homicide prosecutor, sex crimes prosecutor, and she just does not give up. And the person that I brought in to be my chief investigator, Dan McKenna, was a FBI agent for many, many years and supervisor who I worked with. And so he also has that sort of cold case bug in him. And the two of them together with the other investigators and the departments are just a phenomenal team. And it's really been a wonderful thing to see. And for me personally, my parents were the victims of a violent crime in 2010. No one fortunately was killed, but it was a violent crime. And it took about 6 months to arrest someone on that case. And I remember that feeling of having someone arrested, charged, and they eventually pled guilty and got 19 half years in prison. That, you know, for my family, and this isn't true for every family, but for my family, there was nothing that could bring us the relief except that. It was a very traumatic experience, and that kind of accountability and resolution was what my parents really needed, what I needed too. And so I've never forgotten that feeling. And so that is part of what motivates me about this cold case bureau, is that for the families that are left behind, sometimes the only thing that can start that healing process is to have some kind of accountability like that.
I want to make sure we leave time for questions, but I can't let this end without saying, like, what do you want to do going forward? You've got years left in your term. Where are we going from here?
So I would say part of it is building on some of the things that we've started. I mentioned, you know, increasing diversion, meaning non-incarceratory type sentences for and treatment options for low-level, nonviolent first, second-time offenders. So we started a pilot program called Fresh Start, which started in 2 cities and then has now expanded to about 8. And we're planning to take that county-wide. So there's that kind of expansion of the programs we've started. We're building a misdemeanor mental health court with the courts and the legal aid attorneys. And what that means is, you know, great, we have mental health diversion programs at the felony level, but I think we need them at the misdemeanor level, because that's where we start to see the warning signs the earliest and can perhaps get some kind of, again, treatment options before that person escalates into the point where it's a violent crime. So we don't have a misdemeanor mental health program here in the county, or they may have it in other counties, but we don't here in Westchester. So we're developing that, and that's going to take time and resources. Expanding, you know, the victim services that we have available. I have a dream of having a victim witness coordinator in our office, which we don't have. So it is very much up to individual attorneys to kind of make it happen and put it together. I would love to have, I don't have a position right now to get a victim witness coordinator, but that's a dream. You know, I mentioned, I mean, look, recruiting is a big part right now of what we're doing. I mentioned this earlier, but every DA's office across the state, probably in other parts of the country, but I'll just talk about New York, has had an exodus of prosecutors in the past couple of years. And so when you read that headline that says, you know, such and such DA, you know, people are fleeing their office. Look, it's not any individual district attorney. It is what is happening in this profession, like is happening in many professions. COVID has caused people to rethink their lives. And being a prosecutor is a very hands-on job. We were not sitting at home working at home. We all are in the office every day and have been for a long time. You can't do this job. I mean, you can do parts of it. And so we did have, you know, sort of flexible work from home when we could, but it is through the pandemic, we have had a majority of the people in the office, you know, now we're all back in court. I mean, you can't do this job without it being in person with victims, with law enforcement. And some people, you know, have had second thoughts about that and have gone on to other careers, and in much larger numbers than before. Some of the discovery reform that happened has changed the nature of the job. I'm not saying it wasn't the right thing for it to happen. It needed to happen, meaning the obligations of what prosecutors need to turn over to the defense increased greatly in New York State in 2019. And that was necessary, but it really changed the nature of a job for a prosecutor. So we're working on ways to make that more manageable for our office. We just formed a discovery bureau unit and put someone in charge of it, and are trying to, you know, make that more manageable. But there are morale issues right now for ADAs across our state. And we are all looking to fill a lot of empty slots with a smaller pool of people. So that is a big priority for us right now. I hope a year from now, maybe it won't be, but it has to be a huge focus right now. I still think it's the best job in the world, even given all those challenges, because I tell people all the time, you know, where can you have a job where every single day you feel like you're doing something good, something for helping people and having just such an enormous impact and having such great colleagues. So if you know people who want to apply, I'm happy to talk to them and tell them why it's such a great job. So those, you know, those are some of the areas. I mean, obviously always preventing violence is key, but I think that what that means is a lot of different things. It both means looking at the sort of beginning stages. How do we get at the root causes, root problems? A lot of that is outside sort of a DA's office, but we can be a partner. We have things we can do. And then it also means having the most effective, efficient law enforcement response in terms of when violent crime does occur.
It's a lot. Larry, I know questions have been coming in. Did you want to start moderating some questions?
Sure. Thanks, Laura, DA Rocah. That was great discussion. So I got a question here. This is a political one. One of our members asks, a former colleague of yours, Tim Sini in Suffolk County, who was adopting some great reforms with regard to CIU, lost in his most recent bid to become DA. How much of your work is focused on, unfortunately, getting reelected?
That's a great question. Tim is a former colleague and friend of mine, so I'm very familiar with it. And I thought was an absolutely excellent DA with a very similar balance to mine. Look, at the end of the day, honestly, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about that. It was one of the promises I made to myself and to the public that I would do this job. I will do it to the best of my ability. I am not a career politician. I'm an elected official, but I'm really not a political one still, maybe to a fault. I don't think as much about that aspect of the job as perhaps I should, but I am more of a prosecutor and policy person at heart. I think that the one part of it that I mentioned earlier that is tied to this is I do really try to defy the labels, because I think what happened in part with Tim is, even though he had a very balanced approach, he got labeled in a certain way that wasn't necessarily accurate with respect to what his policies actually were. And, again, I think those labels are misleading and dangerous. And of course, when you have a campaign, people are going to do that. So, the most that I think I can do is try to show that I don't fit neatly in one bucket or another, but try to really take a balanced approach to things. And, I hope that works and that people see that and appreciate it. But in Tim's case, I'm not sure that it turned out that way, obviously.
Well, thanks. I got a few more here. So this one, I don't think this topic was covered. What advice would you give to college level women who have experienced repeated sexual abuse after going through approaching the resources on the campus?
That would be very disappointing to hear, but I know it's not uncommon. I would absolutely advise them to go, either to the police department in their area or to a prosecutor's office. I mean, particularly when it comes to sex crimes, sexual abuse, I don't know if they're in our county, but, we have, as I mentioned earlier, a very good responsive team for something like that. They can call the hotline. Really, it doesn't matter what number you press. If you leave a message like that, it's going to get to the right people, and can also just reach out to our main number and ask to speak to an investigator. So I would say if this has happened and they're not getting the response that they feel they should be getting from the school, then they should go to some law enforcement entity outside of the school.
Okay, thanks. Another member asks, you mentioned earlier you were aggressive in sentencing. Can you say more what you mean by that? Do you have a policy on seeking the maximum or not? How are prosecutors instructed on how to decide what sentence they seek?
So no, we don't have a policy on seeking the maximum. I do try to stay, as I mentioned, kind of away from, rules or even policies like that. What I try to impress upon people, because you're right, even inherent in the question is the understanding that these are very case-by-case decisions. That said, I'm trying to impart to people, when we are talking about a crime of violence where someone has been physically hurt or worse, killed, that is a place where I would be less likely to agree to some kind of plea negotiation where we agree to come down. Now, in New York, on a sentence or on a charge that will allow them to get a lower sentence. In New York State, it's complicated in a way that it isn't in the federal system, because the judges, as long as we don't have to come off of the charge, the judge kind of will do their own plea negotiations and say, okay, well, if you plead to, this charge, I'm going to give you X. So we're kind of cut out of it at that point. And it can only be really over our objection. And we just had this happen, and it was reported the other day of a police officer from Peekskill who repeatedly over a 9-month period sexually abused a young woman and abused his power as a police officer by threatening her with arrest and charges if he didn't comply with her. He pled guilty to the whole indictment and many different charges. And the judge told him that he will get 7 years. He was facing 15 years. So it was very much over our objection. I would have sought closer to 15 years on that kind of case because to me, it was such an abuse of power and also the physical sexual abuse aspect. But that's an example of, I guess, of me being, quote, aggressive in sentencing. But we only have so much control over that. And it's on the record that it was very much over our objection. The judge put it on the record and we made that known. So I try to stay away from policies, but I sort of hardline policies, but I try to impart the understanding to the prosecutors. So if they are making the decision and in a case of violence, most line ADAs are not making the decision themselves. They are at least going to their supervisors, bureau chiefs, division chiefs, and very often they actually are coming to us in cases like that. Certainly in all homicide cases, we have to be consulted. So we make the decision together on a case-by-case basis, but we are able to be involved in that process.
Thanks. Oh, this is an interesting one. How are funds from confiscated assets, drug dealers in parentheses, used or distributed? Yeah,
so asset forfeiture money is, any prosecutor's office, is happy when they have asset forfeiture money to use because it's one of the few sort of non-budgetary resources that we have, and particularly here in Westchester, where I have a line item budget, so I don't just get a pot of money to, distribute as I want throughout the office, as they do in the city for the most part, the city DA's offices. I have to get each line item approved and each vacancy approved by the county legislator and board of legislators. So asset forfeiture is something we have a little more flexibility with. We don't have a huge amount of it here, like in some of the other offices that have airports in their jurisdiction, or just a higher number of drug crime or other kinds of crime where we seize assets. And there are rules, very strict rules about how we can use that money. So we can't use it, for example, to hire somebody. It can't be used for personnel. It can be used for law enforcement purposes, crime prevention. So whenever something comes up, I email people and say, "Is this fit in our asset forfeiture rules, please?" Almost always the answer seems to be no, more often than I would like. But we use it, for example, to buy resources for our investigators if they need it. Because they are, out there on the street doing law enforcement work. And so they needed additional resources to do that. But often there are programs that we want to support in communities. And I have had trouble being able to use asset forfeiture money for that.
Okay, thanks. Back to, I guess, the internet telephone scamming. When you get a telephone scam call, where one of the menu options is to press a number to remove your name from future calls, should you just hang up or press a number to remove your number from the call list?
I would. I mean, that's just on a personal level. But
you would hang up?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I don't even answer my home phone anymore. I just don't, because I think that's where most scams come in, but they also come on your cell phone. But
yeah, my dry cleaner is the only person who uses my laptop.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't take any incoming calls that are not someone I know. But maybe that's a little overkill. But
even my mother knows
my
better
policy.
than to call it. Yeah. Okay, let's see. One more here. Do you find your line prosecutors are involved in plea bargaining or sentence bargaining?
They're definitely involved in plea bargaining. I mean, that's part of our job. You know, not every case is going to go to trial. And if it did, we would all have a lot of problems, both the defense attorneys, the prosecutors, and the police officers. We do not have resources for every case that is charged to go to trial. So, and nor would it be in every defendant's interest for their case to go to trial. So plea bargaining is very much a part of the job. But you know, I think that has sort of a slightly negative connotation, the way that it's said, but it's not. I mean, plea bargaining should happen, and what it means is we, the prosecutors, weigh the strength of our case. You know, how likely every case has a litigation risk, no matter how strong the evidence is. There's still always a litigation risk because juries are unpredictable. And witnesses are unpredictable, and your best witness can have a bad day, and et cetera. But we weigh the strength of the case, the strength of the evidence. We weigh the justice factors. You know, is this someone that we need to go to trial to try to get a higher sentence on, or should we, in the interest of justice, come down and find a place of compromise, even though it might mean a lower sentence. You know, I mean, there's all sorts of factors that get weighed from the prosecutor's point of view, and then there's a whole set of factors that get weighed from the defendant and their attorney's point of view as well. And as I mentioned, here in Westchester, the judge is very much a part of the plea negotiations in a way that they're not in the federal system as much, certainly as explicitly. You know, sentencing, bargaining, I mean, again, I think to me that sounds very negative. Of course, the sentence at the end of the day that someone's going to receive is a key part of the decision-making for a defendant and their lawyer, whether they're going to plead guilty or not, because at the end of the day, that's usually their biggest priority, is to not be in prison for as much time. And so, you know, but some defendants have different priorities. They may not care as much about the prison time, but they don't want to, or don't feel they should, you know, say that they're guilty. Same on the prosecutor side. So sentencing is one of the very important prevalent factors that gets considered in the mix of how should this case resolve itself.
I guess my own follow-on question to that is about what percentage of cases, you know, go to trial versus not. I guess that's among defendants who plead not guilty.
Yeah, I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, though. It's a good question. And unfortunately, though, or you know, fortunately or unfortunately, it's very skewed right now. COVID, you know, we had no trials for a year and a half. And so everything is extremely backed up right now. And now we're starting to have a flood of trials getting scheduled. And so I just think the whole process is a little bit off right now in terms of, you know, how cases are getting resolved, which cases are going to trial, which aren't. There are also a lot of people who were incarcerated and then were not because of COVID. There were a lot of people that were let out earlier than they might have otherwise pre-trial. And that impacts the decision to go to trial or not. So, I mean, the great majority of cases in the federal and the state system get resolved by plea, not by trial. That has always been true and probably always will be true. And again, that's not a bad thing, because we don't have the system would crumble under the strain of a trial for every case, or even the majority of cases. So it's still a smaller percentage, but I think right now in particular, that balance is even more out of whack.
Okay. Yeah, the follow on from the questioner, I wasn't questioning whether you should plea bargain, but whether it really is sentence bargaining. In the latter instance, you have more control over the length of the sentence.
Yeah, and no, I understand that. I mean, I get, and what I'm saying, I think, is that the sentence that will be achieved is one of several factors, but a very important one that gets considered on the prosecution side and on the defense side.
Okay, I believe, I'm just checking. Those are all the questions I've seen. I don't know if anyone has any others. One new message. Here we go. With regard to the conviction integrity unit, what is a reputational risk to the office should mistakes or exculpatory evidence be discovered? Is it damaging to the integrity of your office? And what the long-term effect of errors?
That's one way of looking at it. I mean, look, first of all, I would say, every sort of major modern state prosecutor office, certainly in the New York area, has a conviction integrity unit. So it's not like this is something that would just be happening in Westchester. I think over time, I would actually say that it can increase and better the reputation of a prosecutor's office, because I don't think we should be so arrogant to think that we get it right every time. I mean, I hope we do, and we strive to, but we're human and things happen, whether it be as prosecutors or law enforcement. And so we want to have as many guardrails in place as possible, that if that case happens, and look, I'd be thrilled if we never find a case that we have to change the outcome on. But if we do, I'm going to be really glad that we have this in place to try to do something about it now, not 20 years from now when someone's wrong, spent their time in prison and can't get that time back. So yes, I mean, and look, does it cause nervousness and angst amongst the prosecutors in the office? Yes, and I understand that. No one wants to have a microscope on their work, whatever your work is, but it's too important to do that, to not do that. The risk of not doing it is too great. And at the end of the day, it should help build trust from the community that we have this and we're willing to take a look at things through the eyes of really independent professionals when warranted. We don't look at every case, any case. There are guidelines, they're on our website, they're published, and the women who are the attorneys in my unit very much screen the cases. They don't just because someone says, I mean, look, we can't look at every case where someone says a mistake was made, but they know how to screen them, and I trust them to do that.
Thanks. So another one just came in. So I just turned 70. I know that I can opt out of jury duty. I've served on 2 federal and 2 state trials. Please convince me not to opt out.
That's a great question. Please don't opt out. We look, jury duty, whether it be grand jury or trial duty, is a service, a public service. There's a judge in the Southern District of New York, Laura may remember this, who says that other than military duty, it is the most important civic duty you can perform. And I really do believe that, because if you think about it, you have someone's life in your hands, and we need people who are going to be thoughtful and objective and fair to all parties involved, the prosecution and the defense. And my guess is, if you're asking this question, you are one of those people. So it's a service, it's a public service, it's a pain, I know, whether you're working or not working, it's a pain either way, right? It interferes with your job, or it interferes with whatever you're trying to do outside of your job. But it is very much a temporary and hugely important public service.
Thank you.
Laura's seconding that.
Yes. Yeah, no, I'm serving on it myself in years past. I certainly appreciated the opportunity to do so. Yeah, I think we don't have any more questions that anyone sent in. I think we can conclude at this point. I want to thank you, DA Rocah and Laura for joining us and taking us through a wide range of topics. Oh, well, another member writes, now that you and I have reached retirement age, this is an address to me, we have the time to serve on juries. As a recovering lawyer, I want smart people like you on juries.
And most people who serve on juries, I go and speak to the grand jury at the end. They serve for a full month. And I go and speak to them at the end of their term. And almost all of them, have said, you know what, I didn't want to do this, but I'm really glad I did it. It was a wonderful experience. I learned so much. I saw so much. I'm going to tell all my friends it's not so bad. So I see someone applauding that.
All right. Well, thanks again. I think we're concluded. And the recording of this will be available, to the through our website to Temple members only. And everyone enjoy the great spring day, and we'll see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.